welcome to the temporary John J. Homestead. I'm glad to see that you all had time to change out of your costumes for the Met Gala last night. I was hoping that some of you would still show up looking really glam. Anyway, I'm Melissa Vale, trustee of the Friends and chair of the Speakers Committee, and we're excited to have so many of you here with us in person and a whole lot more on the live stream. Welcome especially to the teachers and students in our audience, and especially the members of the History Club from Fox Lane High School. Now everyone please turn off your phones, and that reminds me to do that myself. There we go. First, some webinar logistics for our remote audiences. You are all muted and video of you is turned off. If you have technical problems, please use the chat function to tell us. We already have some questions for our speaker, and we'll collect more from our live audience later, but we want yours too. Please use the chat feature to send them to us. Now, thank yous to the Bedford Playhouse for taking us in during the closure of Bedford House. Please sign up for the Friends newsletter for updates about our construction project. Special thanks to our Speakers Committee for their help with these talks, and to our outstanding public partner, the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, for everything. And as always, and most important, to our members, who are our reason for being. A quick show of hands. How many of you are already members? There we go. And thank you in advance to those who will join soon. Now, you may think that this season is over as of tonight, but our farm market season has just begun, and before we know it, we'll be announcing next season's offerings. In the meantime, watch our website for all the ways we show you how the homestead stays relevant even though the house is closed. Now, here's a Zoom feature that we're keeping, an audience survey. I want to ask you about being an artist yourself. Have you, and I want your answers by show of hands, don't overthink this. Have any of you ever tried to make a work of visual art, either a sculpture, a painting or drawing, photography, or nothing yet? Now I'm going to ask those one at a time. Sculpture, any sculptors here? Okay. How about painters or drawing artists? Okay. How about photography? Okay. And how about nothing yet? Okay. Emily, how did our remote audiences do?
Our remote audience reports 0 have tried sculpture. 60% have tried an effort in drawing or painting. 20% have tried photography, and 20% report nothing yet.
Nothing yet. Good. Okay. And so that's pretty similar to what the in-person audience is. Sometimes the answers come in different, and we're trying to figure out what that might mean. The last part from me before you get to hear our speaker, those of you who've come to our talks know that we look for a J connection to the topic of the evening. This book is full of portrait painters painting the same subjects, sometimes finishing each other's works, and also stories about actually making a living as a painter, or honestly, as a lender or banker to a painter, not easy. Trumbull painted 2 other portraits of Jay in addition to the ones we'll mention tonight. One is now in the reception rooms at the State Department, and one at the National Portrait Gallery, both in Washington, D.C. Both were begun by Gilbert Stuart during Jay's trip to London with John Adams, but Stuart borrowed against the unfinished canvases to pay his personal debts and lost them. Not the only one of those stories we'll talk about. Trumbull bought them in the 1790s and completed the 2 portraits. We are told that it was Jay who recommended Stuart to George Washington, and if we had a royalty on the Washington image on the dollar bill, we would be a very different organization. So now our speaker, Richard Brookhiser, is a journalist and historian. In addition to tonight's book, he is author also of several renowned biographies of founders: Marshall, Madison, Washington, the Adamses, Gouverneur Morris, and Lincoln too. He published his first article in National Review, a cover story, when he was 15. And he was the youngest ever senior editor there at the age of 23. William F. Buckley designated him to be his successor, but changed his mind. He's written for every magazine and journal you've ever heard of, and written and produced many of the history documentaries you've no doubt seen. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 2008 by President George W. Bush. Welcome, Richard Brookhiser.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Can everybody hear? Okay. As you heard, Trumbull knew John Jay. He painted him. He worked for him. He was also distracted by him, I would say, but we may get into that later. When Trumbull was an old man, he told some friends that if you think it's easy to paint a picture, go to that wall and make it tell a story. The story that he wanted to tell throughout his adulthood was a story he had lived through. That was the story of the American Revolution. There were other painters in America or from America at the end of the 18th century. Benjamin West, John Singleton Copley moved to England. Gilbert Stuart lived most of his life here. Also, the Peale family in Philadelphia. And each of these men painted some portraits or occasionally scenes of events from the American Revolution. But Trumbull was the one who wanted to tell the whole story. He wanted to tell the story in a series of paintings. 8 of them hang at the art gallery at Yale. He left them to Yale College in his will. He made copies, larger copies of 5 of them, which are at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford. And then there are 4 life-size images which hang in the rotunda of the Capitol, which I'm sure you've all seen. Millions of people see them as they pass through the rotunda every year. And tonight I want to talk about 4 of those images, 4 of the 8 that are at Yale. But first, tell you a little bit about the artist's life. Trumbull was born in Lebanon, Connecticut, northeast corner of the state, in 1756. His father, Jonathan Trumbull, was a merchant and a politician. He would become the last royal governor of Connecticut and the first post-independence governor of this new state. John was the youngest of 6 children. There were 4 boys, 2 girls. And John always wanted to be an artist. He had that in him from a very early age. Now, his older sisters were taught how to embroider and how to draw, because these were skills given to genteel young ladies in the late 18th century. If you've read Jane Austen, you remember that Emma Woodhouse paints, and Elizabeth Bennet does not paint, which scandalizes her acquaintance, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. But John's older sisters embroidered and painted, and their works were hung over the mantel of the Trumbull family house in Lebanon. And John remembered, when he was an old man, that when he was a boy, he had copied these works on the floor with a pencil. He'd lain on the floor and tried to copy them. He called it the nicely sanded floor, although it must not have been very nicely sanded after he'd finished his work. His mother and his sisters seemed to have indulged him. It sounds like he was his sister's pet growing up. His father did not take this seriously, because being an artist was not a serious occupation. You would be a merchant or a lawyer or a minister. Those were serious careers. And Trumbull and his father argued about this throughout his life. When Trumbull was college age, his father intended to send him to Harvard. That's where he himself had gone and two of his older brothers. And John said to him, well, there is a great painter in Boston, John Singleton Copley, so if you apprenticed me to him, that would cost no more than sending me to Harvard, and then I'd have a profession when I was done. He was sent to Harvard. The last argument they had, his father was still trying to get him to be a lawyer. And John said, well no, I don't want to do that because lawyers deal with the vices of mankind. That's what happens in court, defending or prosecuting vices. I want to display the glories of my country as the artists of ancient Athens did with Athens. And his father said, that's a very good argument, shows you'd be a good lawyer, but I think you've left something out. John said, what is that, sir? What you've left out is that Connecticut is not Athens. I just love that response. Cole Porter could write a song based on that, or Henry James a novel. So John did go to Harvard. He entered in the third year because he was so precocious in classical languages that he began as a junior. Then when he finished, he returned to Lebanon. He taught school. But then the politics of the time took over his life and took over America. This was the crisis of the British Empire. Britain had defeated its ancient enemy France in their last round of fighting, the 7 Years' War. We knew it as the French and Indian War. But one result of that was huge debts, which Britain tried to repay by rationalizing its empire, by not letting smuggling continue, by levying taxes even on the colonies. And this provoked dissatisfaction and finally outrage in America. The British had to send an army to occupy turbulent Boston. And then in April of 1775, the army made a sweep of the countryside looking for caches of weapons and for malcontents. And there were two battles at Lexington and Concord. After those engagements, all of New England rose up. It was like kicking a hive, and every colony sent regiments to besiege Boston. John Trumbull went with a regiment from Connecticut as an adjutant, or an assistant to the commanding officer. And he was stationed with his regiment in Roxbury, which is now part of Boston. Then it was an independent town to the south of it. His birthday was June 6, 1775. Then 11 days later, he heard tremendous commotion coming from 4 miles away, beyond Boston to the north. There was the sound of musket fire, of artillery. There was smoke of burning cities. And this is what was happening. This is the painting he would do 10 years later of the last British charge at Bunker's Hill. Now, the British have come up from the harbor, which is at the top on the right. You can see the water, you can see a little bit of Boston. John would be beyond Boston in Roxbury, further off. The smoke in the sky is coming from Charlestown, which is down the hill out of sight. That's been set alight by shells from British ships in the harbor. But the infantry that was trying to take the American position, this is Breed's Hill. Bunker's Hill was actually higher up behind it, but the battle was named after the lower hill where the fighting climaxed. The British advance was not covered by artillery because their cannon were on warships and the guns couldn't be raised high enough to send shells uphill. So one wave of infantry tried to take the position, going uphill uncovered against dug-in Americans. They were slaughtered. This was the fate of the second British attack. Then by the third attack, the Americans had run out of ammunition. So this is the moment that Trumbull chooses to paint. And what we see are the British in red coming up the hill to wreak vengeance upon the people who have been killing them for the early part of the afternoon. The images of most of the men here are real, either based on portraits from life, or Trumbull would copy other people's paintings. The British commander, Lord Howe, is in the black hat raising his sword about 1/3 in from the left. The American commander, Israel Putnam, is in the blue uniform on the very left-hand side of the painting, and he is giving the signal to retreat. But other officers, it's too late for retreat. The man wielding a musket in the blue suit with the black hat behind the man in the white shirt, that is Major Andrew McClary from the Massachusetts militia. He is about to be killed. Seated on the ground to his left, slumped over, is Colonel Moses Parker from New Hampshire. He is mortally wounded and he will die in captivity. The dying British officer in the middle is Major John Pitcairn. He's in the arms of his son, Lieutenant William Pitcairn. But the painting is named after the man in white in the center foreground. This is Joseph Warren. He was a patriot orator. He would give annual orations to commemorate the Boston Massacre. He'd also helped organize Paul Revere's ride earlier in April, and he had directed the fighting attack on the British retreat back to Boston after the Battle of Concord. He was made a major general before this engagement, but he wanted to serve in the ranks. He has just been hit in the head and killed, and there he lies. The grenadier who's about to bayonet him is being halted by British officer Major John Small. This was an event Trumbull depicted, even though it did not happen. He wanted to show Small's magnanimity, because later in the war, Small had care of American prisoners, and he treated them kindly, which was rarely the case. So Trumbull created a scene where he imagined Small trying to prevent a grenadier from bayoneting and, in effect, desecrating Warren's corpse. But the overall effect of the painting, to me, is not on Warren and his death. What it seems to me is this human charge up the hill. It's irresistible force encountering movable object. And the movable object is us. The first painting Trumbull paints is a painting of defeat. Now, contemporaries then and history-minded people now know that the British victory at Bunker's Hill was Pyrrhic. They lost twice as many casualties as the American defenders. One American general, Nathaniel Greene, said he would sell any hill to the British at that price if they wanted to keep doing that. But we're not seeing any of that in this painting. This painting shows you a moment of death and a moment of defeat. Trumbull begins his series with an American defeat to show us that revolutions are not quick and easy. His second painting would also be a defeat. That would be the death of General Richard Montgomery at Quebec. Then his third painting would be something very different. And he came up with that idea when he was in Europe. After the war, Trumbull went to Europe to study and perfect his art. This was something every artist in America had to do, because you couldn't learn at home. There weren't paintings to copy. There were hardly any masters you could learn from. So every talented American painter went to England or France or Italy. Two of them stayed there, West and Copley. But that's where you went to see great masters and to be taught by great masters. Trumbull went to London, where he studied with Benjamin West. This was the American who'd moved to England years earlier and had become George III's history painter. But he was always very hospitable to fellow Americans. When they came to London, he would encourage them and he would teach them. So Trumbull spent time in London, and then he got an offer to go to France from an American diplomat who'd been traveling in London, said, "Come to Paris. There's even more art in Paris that you can see. You can stay with me for free. You won't have any expenses." This was our minister to France in the mid-1780s, Thomas Jefferson. And so Trumbull goes to Paris. He lives with Jefferson. And the artistic result of his stay is this. Jefferson suggested that the third painting should be the Declaration of Independence. Now, obviously, there's some self-interest in that because Jefferson is there. He's the tallest man in the room. He's also the reddest man in the room, the only one wearing a red waistcoat. But it's also an important event, and Jefferson wanted it memorialized for that reason. So he drew a floor plan of the room in the Philadelphia State House, now known as Independence Hall. Jefferson got some details wrong. There was only one door on that wall, not two, but Jefferson told Trumbull there were two, and so that's what he painted. But so Trumbull has put the drafting committee in the center of the composition. John Adams is on the left in the brown suit. Next to him is Roger Sherman. In the background is Robert Livingston. And then there's Jefferson. And then on his right is Benjamin Franklin, 70 years old. He's the only man in the picture who's looking at us, or almost at us, almost straight out. And Jefferson is handing his document to John Hancock, who is the president or presiding officer of Congress. He's seated at the table. And then around these figures are 42 other men to the left and to the right. And Trumbull worked hard getting their portraits. He would travel up and down the East Coast looking for them. If a man had died, he would try to paint his son, or he might copy an existing painting of the person. And we can't see any of the words on Jefferson's document. But Trumbull shows us aspects of the country that these men were trying to create. One thing is that they're all in civilian clothes. Now we know there's a war going on because there are battle trophies hanging on the back wall. Those are British flags and drums captured during our invasion of Canada. And Jefferson had told him that they were hanging in the room when Congress met. But these men are all civilians, even if they've been veterans. They're dressed in civilian clothes. So this is not a military revolution. This is not a putsch. And they're not hoping to create a military state. The other thing that we can see is that all these men are peers. There's some very wealthy men in the room. Robert Morris is sitting in a light suit in the front row on the left. He's the merchant prince from Philadelphia. Behind him, Charles Carroll of Carrollton is turning away from the main action, having a little conversation with someone standing behind him. He's an extremely wealthy merchant and planter from Maryland. When he would sign the Declaration, someone cracked, there go a few millions. He didn't end up losing his millions, but he certainly put himself at risk. So those are two of the richest men in the new United States. But on the left, third from the left of the seated men in back, is Josiah Bartlett from New Hampshire, who's a farmer and a physician. So they're all dressed approximately the same way. I'm sure Morris's and Carroll's fabrics are better quality than Bartlett's, but the cuts are the same. They're wearing their best clothes, but no one is wearing signs of rank. No one is wearing diadems or jewels or chains or ermines. These men are all peers. This country will not have nobility or orders of nobility. The third thing this painting shows us is that they have deliberated. Now, Trumbull would meet in Paris Jacques-Louis David, and in a few years later, David would sketch the oath of the tennis court, one of the first events in the French Revolution, when the Third Estate declared itself the assembly for the whole nation. And David's painting would show the delegates giving Roman salutes in an expression of their ardor and their enthusiasm. But that's not what's going on here. These men have been talking it over, they've been discussing, they've been arguing, but they've come to a decision. And now the decision is being played out with the drafting committee and John Hancock in the center of the room. So these are three things Trumbull tells us about the new country. His next paintings after this were two more battle paintings. These were American victories. He did the surrender of the Hessians at Trenton, and he did a painting of the Battle of Princeton. Then he did a third surrender, Saratoga, the British Army that gave itself up in upstate New York, and that victory persuaded the French to ally with us openly rather than on the sly as they had been doing. And then Trumbull's next painting is this. This is the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. Now, Cornwallis is in the title, but he's not in the painting. He did not want to be at the surrender, so he is in the little house in the background there. That was his headquarters. He's presumably sulking there after having to give up. He sent an officer, Charles O'Hara, to surrender his sword. He's in the red in the foreground. And O'Hara first offered it to the French commander, General Rochambeau, who is one of the French officers on the left, one of the three at the end of the line of mounted officers on the left. They are standing under the white banner of the House of Bourbon, which was the French royal house. That's their flag. But even though there were more French soldiers at Yorktown than American ones, Rochambeau refused the sword. He said, no, this is George Washington's operation. You have to hand it to him. But Washington was not going to take a sword from a second in command. So he said, no, you have to hand it to General Benjamin Lincoln, who was the American on the white horse. Now, Lincoln's backstory is that he had himself surrendered to the British a year earlier. He'd been in command of Charleston, and the British captured it in a siege, and they had denied him and his troops the honors of war. If you lost a battle and you were given the honors of war, you could march out with your flags flying and shouldering your arms before you gave them up. But Cornwallis had denied Lincoln the honors of war. Lincoln was returned to the Americans in a prisoner exchange. This sometimes happened with officers. So now here he is. Cornwallis has been denied the honors of war, and Washington has indicated that O'Hara has to give his sword to Lincoln. So karma wins in the end. Washington is mounted on the chestnut horse. If you study this painting carefully, he's almost smiling. Very rare expression for him, but he's earned it. Maybe the most interesting American is Alexander Hamilton right behind me, next to the horse. He's young, he's got the world before him. In the mounted Americans, behind the horse, we have Lafayette, and we also have Baron von Steuben. These were two foreign officers who came to help us, not from realpolitik, but from conviction. They decided that the American cause was their own, and Steuben moved to America. He lived in Utica, New York. That's where he died. And Lafayette would go back to France, but when he died, soil from Bunker's Hill was placed on his grave at his own direction. And if Trumbull's series had been only about the war, this would have been the right place to end it. Picture number 7. But he did one more, which was this one. This is George Washington returning his commission to Congress in December of 1783. Yorktown is in October 1781. Took a long time to negotiate the Treaty of Paris to wrap things up. And then it took time for the British to evacuate and for America to reoccupy New York and Charleston. After the British left New York in November 1783, Washington wrote to Congress and said, "What do you want me to do now?" And they said, "Come to us and surrender your commission." Congress then was meeting in Annapolis. They had been chased out of Philadelphia by a near riot by unpaid junior officers. They'd gone on to Princeton and to Trenton, and then they had settled in the State House in Annapolis, which is still there today. And so Washington has come. He's standing there and holding his commission in his right hand out to Congress. By the time Trumbull painted this was one of the last paintings he did. Many of the congressmen had died. He was able to use images that he'd already used in other paintings. Jefferson is there. He's sitting in front of the left-hand jamb of the door on the left. You can see his forehead is whitened and he's got reddish hair. James Madison is standing to the right of the man in the red coat in front of the other door jamb. He was not actually in Annapolis, but he was a member of Congress. He was home in Montpelier doing family business, but Trumbull wanted him here. Now, this is the second time we see a session of Congress. The Declaration was the first time. And there, Jefferson handed a piece of paper to the right, and here Washington is handing a piece of paper to the left. So these two paintings make a parenthesis. But there are two things that are very different about this painting from the Declaration. One is that there are lots of uniforms here. The Declaration was all civilians, but here you have Washington in uniform, lots of officers behind him, and the civilian congressmen are to the left, the officers are in the middle to the right. With a very little tweaking, pictorial and historical, this could be a very familiar scene. It could be Cromwell dismissing Parliament. It could be Napoleon and his brother dismissing the Directory. It could be the military saying, "We've been fighting, we've been bleeding, you've been talking. Now that's over. Now we who've been doing all the work are now going to have the power and the authority." But that is not what is happening here. That's not this general, not ever. Behind Washington there's a chair, and chairs in paintings of this period often stand for thrones. But this chair is empty. Washington's not going to sit in it. On the chair there's a cloak, a reddish purple cloak. Cloaks are also a symbol. They're a symbol of imperial or kingly power. When Trumbull's friend David painted Napoleon crossing the Alps, he gives him this beautiful billowing red cloak coming out behind him. But again, Washington is not going to wear this cloak. He's not going to take that role. The other difference in this painting is the presence of women and girls. The two young women on the floor are the daughters of Charles Carroll. Again, Charles Carroll from Maryland. He's the man in the gray suit. He's got his arm around one of them. They were actually there, Mary and Patsy. They're 5 and 13. And then up in the gallery, there is Martha Washington. She's in the turban in the center. And to the left of her is her granddaughter by her first husband, Nellie Custis. And to the left of her is Harriet Wadsworth, whom Trumbull had hoped to marry when he was younger, but she died of tuberculosis. And the reason the women are here is to show, I think, what revolution should be for. Revolution should be for normal life. That's how they should end. If they don't end this way, then it's just a sick man turning over in bed. It's just violence and oppression, another page of it. But Trumbull wanted to show, he hoped that the American Revolution had ended this way. And so he brought women into his last image. This was the series that he hoped to make. It took him 45 years. There were many distractions, periods where he painted other things, periods where he didn't paint at all. But he stuck with it. He stuck with it through the diminution of his talent. But he finished the story, and by the end of his life, he'd found his wall and made it tell that story. Thank you very much.
We're going to, I have a bunch of questions that I'm going to start with, but also if you want to give us your own questions, raise your hand and Emily will give you a note card and a pencil, and she'll bring them up to me and we'll ask them too. I'm going to ask you to tell us more about John Jay and
Sure.
about their relationship. I want two angles on it. One is that we tell the story of John Jay and the Treaty of Paris as Jay, in our own immodest way, being the indispensable man and being the one who insisted on negotiating with the British without keeping the French negotiating alongside. And we understand that he's the one who really insisted on that, disobeying direct instructions from Congress to do that. And so we think that was an important role. You don't go into the Treaty of Paris a lot, and you don't actually talk that much about Jay, even though they worked together on several occasions. So one is, do you have any thoughts about Jay's role in the Treaty of Paris? And two, what was their relationship? Did they enjoy each other? Did they challenge each other? They were both reserved and proper men. I mean, do you have a sense of their personal relationship? So
Well,
whichever one you want to take first.
Yeah, let's start with Jay himself. Jay was a very hard-headed guy, very realistic man. When the American diplomats were gathering in Paris to negotiate this treaty, it was a five-man team. And he told one of his colleagues, he said, treaties never mean anything except the relation of the signatories at the moment that they sign. So a treaty can say, well, you know, in the future we'll do this, we'll do that. And then Jay, no. No, a treaty just is a snapshot of where the power relations are at this moment. And then to demonstrate that, of the relative worthlessness of treaties, he threw his clay pipe into the fireplace where it broke. You know, he said, that's what treaties are worth. Mm-hmm. So yes, he had a very hard head on his shoulders. Trumbull worked for him. You know, Trumbull was not his peer, he was his employee. This was a period where Trumbull had been trying to raise money to complete his series of paintings. He produced two of them, Bunker's Hill and The Death of General Montgomery at Quebec, which we didn't see, and he'd begun several others, and he had ideas for more, but he wasn't getting enough financial response for it. Now, how did you make money as a painter in the 18th century? Well, if you were lucky, you'd have a patron. Benjamin West was employed by George III. He got £1,000 a year to be his history painter. Well, Trumbull's not going to get that. But painters could make money by selling prints, series of prints. This is the way to get the lower part of the art market. people who wanted to see these images, but of course were not wealthy enough to actually buy a painting, but they could buy a print. So a painter would find an engraver, he'd have to pay the engraver up front, but then if the series, or if the painting, if the engraving or the series of engravings got enough subscribers, he could make a very nice profit. Well, that's the hope, but he'd been trying to get subscribers and he'd failed. So in the mid-1790s, he essentially gave up on painting. And one thing he did to live was to work for John Jay on Jay's diplomatic mission to England. Now this was to tie up loose ends from the Revolutionary War. The British were supposed to have evacuated forts in the old American Northwest. They hadn't done it. They were still in those forts to control the fur trade with the Indians who lived there. The British were supposed to have returned slaves that they had liberated from American slave owners. They hadn't done that. There were a number of other sore points.
Including a Jay slave.
Well, although it's interesting that Jay did not press them on this issue.
Right.
Because Jay was already president of the New York Manumission Society, which would lobby for the end of slavery in New York. And remember, New York was a big slave state. It was a northern state, but New York City had more slaves than any other city in America except for Charleston in the 18th century. And Jay did very useful work with that society. But so his assignment was to go to London and try and settle all these points. And he employed Trumbull as his secretary. And then Trumbull was tasked with going to Paris to tell our minister to France, James Monroe, what was going on. Now, Monroe and Jay were not happy with each other. Jay didn't want to tell Monroe the state of his negotiations. This irked Monroe. Trumbull said to him, look, I can't show you a copy of the treaty, but I've memorized it. I can recite it to you if you like. And Monroe was not happy with that. And then when Trumbull was in France, the French saw him as persona non grata. I mean, here's this guy, he's working for this diplomat who's making arrangements with our enemy, England. So why is he here? And Trumbull applied for a passport to leave. He couldn't get one. He's getting the runaround. And finally, he turns to his artist friend, Jacques-Louis David, asking for help. And then David says, look, you've got your copy, you've got your painting of Bunker Hill here, because he'd been taking it to an engraver on the continent. Come along with me. Let's go to the police. And so David goes in and he says, look, this man is as good a revolutionist as we are. He saw the Battle of Bunker Hill here. He painted it. You cannot, keep this guy without a passport. So he manages to get a passport for his fellow artist, and that's how Jay gets out. That's how Trumbull gets out and back to Jay. So it doesn't strike me as a very close relation, but it was useful to Trumbull at that point in his career. And then, of course, he has to paint Jay, because he's got to paint all these people. And you have one of the images he made, and that was part of his task as an artist to keep images of these faces and also tell the stories in which they took part.
Well, the business of collecting likenesses is something that he took very seriously.
Very
he went around,
seriously.
and then people would go to his paintings to look at the likenesses, right? I mean, that
Yes,
was one
and
thing that they were valued for.
They would publish keys, and say they'd number, they'd do like a line drawing with numbers. Now the trouble is that some of these keys are wrong. The keys to the Declaration, there's a man in a hat, one of the delegates, and people still argue about who is he. I think the consensus now is he's John Dickinson, but this argument goes on. One of the keys of the Battle of Princeton, there's an American artillerist being bayoneted, and he was identified, he was given a name, but that man moved to Brooklyn after the war and died in 1795. But this artillerist is being killed before our eyes. And a historian in New Jersey not that long ago figured out who he actually was. So these keys are not always reliable.
Mm-hmm. About Trumbull as a diplomat, you've got some great phrases in here. You say that he was productive, incendiary, and a crackpot at different parts of his career.
Oh, yeah.
You,
Well, okay, the crackpot part. Latin America was already stirring unhappily. And one of the Latin American patriots was Francisco de Miranda, Venezuelan. And he came to America during the Revolution. He met Hamilton. He basically met everybody. He also served in the French Revolution. He was a general in the French army. He knew Catherine the Great, rumored to have been one of her lovers. It's not clear whether he was or not. And he was always trying to liberate Venezuela. And Trumbull was one of the people who he befriended. Trumbull actually designed a house for him, which was never built, but Trumbull made images and plans for it. And then Trumbull, in 1799, he writes George Washington, who's retired after his second term. And he says, look, there's something even greater that you can now accomplish. You know, you can lead the fight to liberate Latin America. And Trumbull explains that they're on the point of freeing themselves. If they get help from revolutionary France, they will become like revolutionary France, and we'll have millions of Jacobins living south of us. But if they get help from us, then they'll become more like us, and that will be much better. So this is the letter he writes, and then Washington is always very practical. You know, it was miraculous that he got to Yorktown, but this plan is he's supposed to go to South America and liberate it. And he just starts by saying, look, the political situation is such. We have two parties, and one party does not want us interfering on this side of the European war, so they would not support this. He's just throwing cold water on this, and of course never does it. Trumbull's, he worked for Jay. He did a good job for Jay, and then, as I said, he had all this trouble getting out of France. You know, and the diplomacy is interesting. It gives you a window on some interesting events, but in terms of Trumbull and what he had to do with his life, this was a distraction. Mm-hmm. You know, this was a period he hadn't been able to find buyers. He had given up on his painting. He had for 4 or 5 years. And then he came back to it. And his skills had deteriorated. I mean, he knew that himself.
He also had one eye, basically, right? He had damaged the sight in one eye.
Yes.
And I just don't get how you can be a painter with one eye. But
well, he wasn't the only one. Camille Pissarro also had just one eye. So it does happen. There was a moment when he and Gilbert Stuart are young friends studying with Benjamin West in London, and Trumbull has just done a painting, and Stuart said, this looks like it was done by a one-eyed person, not knowing that Trumbull, only had sight in one eye, and Trumbull was very offended, but, they patched it up. They always remained good friends. It sounds like it was hard not to be friendly with Stuart. He was, in some ways, a very irresponsible man, but it sounds like a very gregarious, outgoing one.
So many of these painters went back and forth between America and Europe, in particular London, I think, and even when the countries were at war. How did that work? How were they given a pass? Were they accepted? Were there different standards? How did that work?
Right. Well, West and Copley had simply moved there. I mean, West had moved there many years earlier, and Copley was a loyalist, so he had to go. Trumbull was given an assurance. Trumbull was in the army, but he had left angered over a question of seniority. He'd become a colonel, but he thought his rank was begun at a later point than it should have been, so he lacked the necessary seniority. And he kind of quit in a huff, really, although, military men take honor very seriously. So then, this was a period after France openly allies with us, after the Battle of Saratoga. There's a moment when the British realize this is now a world war, and maybe we should try and make nice with our former colonists before we have to fight them and France. And in that little window, Trumbull was assured that, well, if you go to London and you just paint, you'll be fine. And so that's what he did. Well, it turned out he wasn't fine. There was a midnight knock on the door where he was staying, and he was picked up as a spy. And he was thrown into Bridewell, which was a London prison. And his friends had to rally to him. Benjamin West went to the king, and the king said, I can't interfere with a legal proceeding, but if he is convicted and sentenced to death, I will give him a royal pardon. So there was that.
Meaning he wouldn't be hanged.
He would not be.
Yeah.
He would be spared. His life would be spared. Pro-American members of Parliament visited him, Charles Fox, Edmund Burke. There was always a very vocal pro-American minority in Parliament, but it was very small, so it couldn't affect policy really until 1781. And then, Trumbull is trying to think, well, how do I get myself out? Do I try and defend myself in court? And he's advised, no, try to use political influence. And then finally there came a moment when the Brits just decided, okay, leave. You've got 30 days, you've got to post £400 bond and get out of the country. So he does that. And then he comes back after the war, when it's, we're no longer at war, so back he comes to resume his studies.
You talk about the women and girls in the in the last painting that you talked about. In the first painting, there was a man with a sword. Behind him was a black man. Who was that? And talk about Trumbull's treatment of people, of black people, and also you talk a lot in your book about his treatment of native peoples and
Right.
Indians.
Right.
How did he see those groups, and how did he
Right.
see them differently from each other?
Well, Trumbull was, by his own account, he was interested in Connecticut's Indians from his boyhood. The Mohegans lived in eastern Connecticut, and they had allied with the settlers during the Pequot Wars. And so they had, in effect, a reservation in eastern Connecticut. And some dignitary would come every year to go to Hartford. And on the way, he would stop in Lebanon at Governor Trumbull's house. And so Trumbull was used to these Mohegan Indians passing through his house in his boyhood. And he had kind of romantic notions about them. There was a delegation of Creeks who came to negotiate a treaty with the Washington administration. And this was important because the Creeks had allied with the British during the Revolution. They were a large, capable Indian nation, and you wanted to try and, get them in your good graces. And so Trumbull sketched 5 of these men on the sly, and he made very interesting sketches of them. I mean, when he writes about them, it's sort of, noble savage rhetoric. But these sketches, these are individuals. There's no generalizing in his hands. He's giving you these people, and they're all very different, and their attitudes are very different. I mean, one guy looks kind of cocky, another one looks like he's sort of daydreaming. I mean, they really are very skillful, very individualized pictures. Oh, and then when he's trying to tell Washington, you got to liberate South America, he says, look, when it's free, there will be 2 countries. There'll be Mexico and Peru. I mean, there'll be much larger than Mexico and Peru now are. And Mexico should have an Aztec monarch, and Peru should have an Inca monarch. So that's, he's still like thinking along those lines. Blacks just don't seem to me to have registered with him very much. But as you said, in Bunker Hill on the lower right corner, there are two men. There's Lieutenant Thomas Grosvenor. He's from Pomfret, Connecticut, northeastern corner of the state. And with him, behind him, slightly behind him, is Asaba, who at the moment of the battle is his slave, although in a 1790 census, Asaba is free. So at some point, he was free. But they have been fighting together. I mean, you can see from the state of their garments, and the lawyer from Pomfret is actually wounded. He's got a bullet in his hand. And then also in that painting, I mean, you couldn't see it here, but in the left background, very faint, there's a second black man who's Peter Samuel, who's credited with killing Captain McFarland, the British officer who's dying in the arms of his son. There were several men who claimed to have fired that shot. Peter Samuel was one of them. He was a free black man who fought in that battle. So he's there. And then in the Quebec painting, which I didn't show you, there is Colonel Joseph Lewis Cook. That was his white name. His Mohawk name was Actien Haranquen. He'd been an Abenaki who'd been captured by the Mohawks, and he self-identified as a Mohawk. He had a black father and an Indian mother, and he fought for the Americans during the Revolution. And he was at the Battle of Quebec, and he's in Trumbull's painting. So these are the three black figures who show up in this series. One interesting omission is William Lee, who was Washington's personal slave throughout the war, and he's actually the third person mentioned in Washington's will. The first two are George and Martha, and then the third is William Lee. Washington said that all his slaves should be freed at the death of his wife, but he freed William Lee specially and said he should have an annuity of $20 a year. Or if he wants to stay a slave, he can do that, but he should still get $20 a year, and this is for his service to me in the war. And Trumbull did paint an early portrait of Washington with a servant slave behind him, and he would have seen William Lee, but this image is not at all what William Lee actually wore. He just used the conventions of the black servant slave of an officer of 18th century painting. And they had these orientalizing costumes. They were depicted in turbans or feathers or whatnot.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe some of them were actually dressed that way. But William Lee was not. He wore a suit that looked like a soldier's uniform during the war.
I hate to say it, but we have run out of time. Emily, do you have any questions for us? I have one more question for you. Well, it's got two parts. It's cheating. We're heading into a period where it's going to be revolution, revolution, revolution. Are we getting it right, or what's the biggest lesson of the revolution that we don't get right? And two is, did you end up liking Trumbull at the end of spending all this time with him? Do you like him, or do you admire him, or how did you end up feeling about him?
Well, for revolutions, they have to be maintained. I mean, they're not perpetual motion machines, even if they are net good. They have to be upheld. And Trumbull himself, he wrote a letter to Jefferson. He said, "I want to give present and future sons of misfortune glorious lessons of their rights and of how to maintain and uphold them." So he was thinking, this happened. It could happen again, or hopefully not that bad, but you have to keep at this. It's not just a one-time thing and then you relax. As for Trumbull, Yeah, we didn't even get into his illegitimate son, which was not so
Or his
not so
wife
good.
who
But
drank too much.
yes, I admired him because he had an idea. He wanted to tell this story, and for all his dithering around and distraction and this, that, and the other thing, he kept at it for 45 years, and he finally finished it. So good for him.
Good for him, and good for you for writing this book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Rick will be signing books upstairs. Please come and hang around with us for a little while. Keep coming back to the Homestead website at least and see what we're up to. And thank you all for coming tonight. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.